Today we'll start a new series of discussion by looking at a joint anti-terrorism drill that China is holding with Belarus in Minsk and finding out what it hopes to achieve. And in the US, over 400 medics have been charged with drug-related crimes that cost taxpayers around $1.3 billion. Just how serious is healthcare fraud in the US? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Liu Xin. Hardly a day goes past without a story related to terrorism hitting headlines worldwide. Today, for instance, Australia's domestic security bodies, including police and the National Spy Agency, is to be centralized under a single ministry to tackle the rising threat of lone wolf attacks. There is also the question mark over whether IS leader Baghdadi is really dead or in hiding. The threat of terrorism is like the sword of Damocles, ever present above our heads, and one which no nation can now afford to ignore. Starting today, The Point examines this subject in a four-part series, and our focus in this edition is Eurasia. A joint drill codenamed United Shield 2017 is wrapping up today in a suburb of the Belarusian capital, Minsk. Jointly held by the Chinese People's Armed Police Force and the internal troops of the Belarusian Interior Ministry for the first time, the training has included shooting, search and rescue scenarios, mine clearance and a simulated attack against militant training bases. This has been the most recent of almost annual exercises China holds with other countries, especially members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO. How have China's joint terrorism drills helped in the war against terrorism? Is there a difference in how the West and SCO members define terrorism? I'm pleased to be joined in Moscow by Mr. Dmitry Babich, a political analyst from Sputnik International, and in Beijing by Professor Teng, Director of the Center for Arms Control at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Babich, let me come to you first. Now, China has carried out many anti-terrorism drills with its neighbors, especially Russia, in recent years. What is the strategic aim of this latest training in your eyes, and how can these exercises help warn and deter terrorists?
Well, I think it's a very important and useful exercise because no one is secure from terrorism right now, including Belarus. Belarus is one of the most peaceful post-Soviet states on the territory of the former Soviet Union, but even it was a victim of a terrorist attack. I think about 7 years ago there were two very, very devastating explosions in the metro in the Belarusian capital, Belarus. Minsk, I'm sorry, in the Belarusian capital, Minsk. So basically the idea to conduct joint exercises with Russia, joint exercises with China is a useful one. And it's interesting that destroying a terrorist training center, this is included in the scenario. I think it's a very good idea because there are such training centers in Central Asia, in Afghanistan. There were such training centers in the Caucasus. So basically our countries are interested in destroying the terrorists at their training centers before they start to inflict damage on our countries.
Professor,
and of course,
Professor
usually there is a lot of criticism from the West, but I think it's simply misguided.
We will address those criticism in just a moment. But Professor Tern, let me ask you about the different roles armed police forces and militaries play. This one is between the armed police and internal forces of the two countries. What's the significance, and what's the significance of partnering with Belarus in your eyes?
Actually, the two parts of the armed forces in China have different, responsibilities. For example, the armed police force is to, maintain the peace and the stability in the society of China, and our military, of course, not only to defend our country from any invasion, but also today we can see the PRA has a good responsibility in maintaining the peace in regional affairs and also in safeguarding the peace of the world. So I think these two groups, they all included in the armed forces of China, but they share different responsibilities.
What about the importance of Belarus in terms of fighting terrorism for China, Professor Teng?
Of course, Belarus is a very important country in European continent, and in recent years, Belarus also is facing the challenge of terrorism. So I think such a deal between China and Belarus can give the two countries good experience in cooperation in dealing with terrorism, and also they can exchange their experience in dealing with challenges like the terrorism, extremism, and the separatism.
Mr. Babich, how do you look at the evolving picture of terrorist threats surrounding countries like Russia and China? How do you understand are the biggest terrorist threats that countries like Russia and China are faced with in today's world?
I think that in today's world, let's not hide it, terrorism very often has a religious character, unfortunately, and unfortunately very often the Western countries are not very keen to condemn any form of terrorism. They often divide the terrorists into the bad ones, the ones who attack the West, and the good ones who are fighting, for example, the legal Syrian government, or who make rebellions in Russia and even in China. So in this situation, I think Russia, Belarus, and China, we have a common interest in fighting this danger. Let me remind you that when Russia and China held joint exercises in the Baltics, there were questions from the West, like, what are the Chinese doing in the Baltics? Well, my question is, what are the Westerners doing in South China Sea? Obviously, it's not a place for the American Navy or for the navies of the EU member countries. So I think that terrorism today is a global threat, and in this situation, Russia and China were interested in global security. We're interested in hitting the terrorists while they're still far away from our borders. That's why Russia, quite legally, on request from the Syrian government, sent its aviation to Syria. In the same way, I think this is one of the reasons why China holds a very balanced and legalistic view on the situation in Syria, even though it doesn't send any troops there.
Definitely,
so
the fight against terrorism is...
the terrorist threat is
Mr.
global.
Babich, let me just jump in here. I think it is true that the problem with terrorism is compounded by this kind of ideological struggle that countries in the East or countries like Russia is having against the West. Professor Teng, let me ask you this question, however. The SCO, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's definition of a terrorist action has been controversial according to Western media. For instance, the English dictionary defines terrorism as unlawful use of violence and intimidation in the pursuit of political aims. Some people interpret the SCO's definition as too broad, for instance, by including anyone with the intention to threaten the authority of a government as a terrorist. What do you make of the difference they pointed out?
According to our study, there are at least 60 definitions about terrorism in the world. From different countries, we have some different definitions on the terrorism. So I think today, I don't think the international community could have single or unilateral definition in this regard. Different countries have different definition toward the approach by the terrorism. For example, the United States said sometime the separatism in Xinjiang or in Tibet are not terrorism or separatism. They sometimes they even support such activities in China. So I think this is a very tough job for the international community to have unique definition on terrorism.
Is it possible, Mr. Babich, for the world to come to an agreement as to what terrorism is, or we really have to face the terrorism that are most harmful to us and just fight along?
Well, I think the problem is that various countries argue over the definition of terrorism, but when terrorists start to act against them, then immediately they say this is terrorism without thinking about any definitions. I think in the future we can come to a common definition of terrorism when certain countries abandon their hopes to impose their ideology, their political system on the other countries. The whole argument, the whole discussion about terrorism, the reason why it became so complicated is because certain countries want to change the world, to change regimes around the world according to their own, sometimes utopian, ideological views. I don't want to whitewash the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had such pursuits in its history. Nazi Germany had such, also awful global visions of changing regimes around itself. Now, unfortunately, the West, by the West I mean the United States and the EU, they have contracted a similar disease. Under the pretexts of imposing democracy, they basically helped topple legally elected governments in various parts of the globe. And unfortunately, in this situation, very often they make alliances with people using political violence, basically with terrorists. To my mind, the Islamists who are trying to topple the Syrian government, who make explosions in Damascus, in Aleppo, in other cities, they were terrorists from the beginning, even though the West presented them as freedom fighters.
Yeah, Mr. Babich, we have very limited time. We will discuss this topic tomorrow, but again, just very briefly, Professor Teng, let me give the last question to you. Looking ahead, in light of the recent terrorist activities we've seen in Europe, what could be done better to counter terrorist threat? Maybe it's an impossible question to answer in 20 seconds, but I still would like to hear you answer.
First, I should say the international community should have a consensus in dealing with such a challenge. This is a common challenge for the whole international community. Second, I think all the countries should share their information in dealing with the terrorism. This is very important for countries like France, the UK, and even the countries in Africa. So this is a very important step for the countries to cooperate, I think, at the first step. But the most important thing for the international today is to have consensus in dealing with such a challenge.
Many thanks to the two gentlemen, Professor Teng Jianqun, Director of the Center for Arms Control at the China Institute of International Studies, and Mr. Dmitry Babich from Sputnik International. And here is my first point. Now, I observe it from, again, a personal perspective. It's impossible to prepare against the lone wolf attacks, but that does not mean that we shouldn't step up our vigilance and preparedness. Sometimes it may even seem that all the security precautions go over the top, but imagine the alternative. So although we all curse at standing in long queues at airports and being frisked when entering secure areas, the fact is that there is little alternative given the inherent high risk we're faced with. Of course, we all miss the good old days, but those days are long over. Welcome to the real world. You're watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this. Stay with us. Last week, the U.S. Justice Department announced the largest ever healthcare fraud enforcement action. 412 people were charged across 41 federal districts, including 115 doctors, nurses, and other licensed medical professionals for allegedly participating in false billings to the tune of some $1.3 billion US. Over 120 defendants, including doctors, were charged for prescribing and distributing opioids and other dangerous narcotics. How serious a problem is healthcare fraud in the U.S. and how is it related to opioid abuse, which is another serious public health issue in the country? I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Dr. Jeff Staples, Chief Operation Officer and Acting Vice President of Medical Affairs from the Hospital United Family Healthcare. I'm also joined in Philadelphia by Mr. Li Da, Deputy Secretary General of Beijing Pharmacists Association, and in South Carolina by Mr. Shi Lu, Assistant Professor at the Department of Public Health Sciences of Clemson University. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Dr. Staples, now the charges came as part of what the U.S. Justice Department said was the largest legal action against healthcare fraud in the U.S. history. 412 people, 1.3 billion people, 1.3 billion U.S. dollars. How did they manage to do all of this?
Well, I don't think that anybody goes into healthcare intending to commit fraud. I think people go into healthcare trying to help people and help patients, help them manage their pain and their conditions. And it can be a slippery slope. When patients come in, pain is very hard to quantify, and physicians will try to address the pain and make them feel better, and they should be prescribing a reasonable amount of medication. What happens sometimes is physicians will prescribe maybe more than is needed, and the patients either have a habit already or will develop a habit, and they'll come back to the physicians that they find provide more medication, more narcotics, and then a cycle begins where the physicians begin to get a reputation for prescribing narcotics, prescribing more narcotics than they should, and the physicians want to keep the patients happy. They've developed a good business, they've developed a reputation, and the cycle kind of feeds itself. And there aren't the proper controls in place in many instances to manage this proactively or effectively.
Yeah. Mr. Li Da, now those arrested, including 120 doctors and other people charged for their roles in prescribing and distributing opioid painkillers. How are opioid prescriptions managed and regulated in the U.S.?
All right, so the controlled substance are heavily regulated in the States. In 1970, American FDA issued the Controlled Substance Act that classifying all medications into 5 categories according to their risk of abuse and likelihood of dependence when abused. So that's number 1. Number 2, they have a prescription drug monitoring program that keep track of the patient-specific information at the point of dispensing. So with these 2 systems, they should have a good management networking. That's how America managed the narcotics.
However, it seems that the system has not been working very well, but we'll come to that in just a moment. Professor Shi Lu, now drug overdose is the leading cause of accidental death in the United States, and opioid addiction is a major part of it. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, opioids, including painkillers and heroin, killed more than 33,000 people in the U.S. in 2015. Why are so many people taking opioids?
Well, this comes back to deep tradition in the U.S. I mean, overall, the Americans, I'll say in the world, compared to other countries, compared to China in particular, they tend to over-medicate when their pain conditions. And what's very significant is that there was a 5-sentence letter published in New England Journal of Medicine back in the 1980s. Declaring that the opioid drugs are not all that addictive, and because of the prestige of that journal, a lot of the physicians and patients are misled to believe that this kind of medicine is not all that addictive, while actually it is quite addictive. Yeah, that's one of the underlying cause.
Yeah. Are there any other major driving forces behind the fact that a lot of Americans seem to tend to take a lot of drugs?
So from my perspective, the chronic pain...
Professor Shi Lu, please.
Okay. Yeah, my understanding is that the stressful, like say the stressful American life is one driving force. The other driving force is the fact that the kind of abuse between of opioid drugs that's very hard to falsify in an individual basis. When the patient comes in saying he has a pain, and doctor collude and give him the medicine when he should not give the prescription. It's very hard to the government and or the insurance company to sending their people to falsify it, because pain is self-defined, and you cannot do a test and say this person is not in pain and therefore should not get it.
Yeah,
So
Dr.
that's
Staples.
the other
Sure.
driving force.
Dr.
which is,
Staples.
hard to define.
Yeah, according to what we just heard, there are these regulations, there are these mechanisms in place. But how come all of this has not stopped these hundreds of people from fraudulent actions? And how did you define these actions as being fraudulent? As this professor just said, you know, sometimes you cannot tell whether people have been over-prescribed drugs.
Sure. Sometimes the patient presents with false complaints, presenting themselves as being a chronic pain patient. Again, pain is very hard to quantify. It's very hard to measure. So if a patient comes in and complains of pain, then a physician may prescribe. Opioids. It's very inconvenient for a patient to only get a 3-day prescription or a 5-day prescription. So in the interest of patient satisfaction, sometimes a physician will prescribe for a month or more, and sometimes they'll offer renewals. Then a lot of times patients will not get the medication from a physician. They'll get it from a friend or a family member who's gotten it from a physician. And there develops kind of this informal network of people accessing healthcare to get narcotics to then pass on to the secondary market. So there's a lot of lack of control of opioids in the U.S. from a legislative perspective and from a controls perspective on the physician prescribing side and also on the dispensing side.
Mr. Li, now how do you compare China's pharmaceutical regulation compared with that of the United States? Is China also facing similar problems, or is China on the other direction?
That's a very good question, because opioid abuse is an universal challenge. However, Chinese government has been adapting a quite conservative approach. In all Chinese hospitals, all staff dealing with narcotics must be certified by the authorities, and the certificate is only valid for 3 years, and they are supposed to take independent government-organized CME to renew the certificate. On the other hand, the dispensing is very well controlled, that in each hospital there's a designated desk counter to dispense, and all prescriptions must be registered and reported on a daily basis. So in general, China's approach is very conservative but pragmatic compared with the American approach, which is a little bit too liberal.
Professor
So
Shi
that's
Lu.
why that's
Yeah, Professor Shi Lu, Federal Reserve Chairperson Janet Yellen last week said the opioid epidemic is so pervasive that it is holding back the nation's labor market. How is this epidemic affecting the U.S. labor market and the U.S. economy?
Yeah, there's one very unique feature of this kind of opioid epidemic, which is it affects the working age population, and it affects the middle class, people who are more who kind of are rich, who have decent income. So it's unlike some of other epidemics who affects the low income people, and a lot of them do not have a job to begin with. But this kind of this opioid addiction epidemic affects like lawyers or even doctors themselves. So it does hurt the labor force, those high income working age labor force. So in that sense, it's particularly economic crisis as well in places that were hit hard by this opioid epidemic.
Dr. Staples, the U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions said that too many doctors, nurses, and pharmacists had chosen to put profit ahead of their patients. Quote, they seem oblivious to the disastrous consequences of their greed, and their actions not only enrich themselves often at the expenses of taxpayers, but also feed addictions and cause addictions to start. How do you think the issue can be best addressed and doctors' overprescription behaviors can be stopped in the U.S.?
Well, it's very complicated, and it's really multifactorial. I think there first should be some legislative controls over the prescription and availability of opioids. I think you need to start with a lot of education on physicians regarding what is appropriate prescriptive behavior. You have to educate the patient to decrease the patient demand. And you should probably put some controls in place and some monitoring of prescription habits and dispensing habits in the pharmacies. So when you see pockets of overprescription or you see patients who have a particularly high number of opioids prescribed to them, you can do some investigation and see if there's a problem going on.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Mr. Li, very briefly, please, what are the lessons can other countries learn from this epidemic and the drug control system in the U.S.?
All right, so first and foremost, in addition to Dr. Staples' comments, I would suggest, number one, technically, a centralized platform to monitor the dispensing and use of narcotics is critical. Lastly, the health care must restore the lost art of healing, that the human face of health care. We should not be profit-driven, but should provide really human, patient-centric care to resolve such chronic medical conditions like chronic pain syndrome.
And Professor Shi, what's your take on this question?
I'll say the one lesson is big data helps. Big data analysis helps. It's very hard to detect the fraud on the individual case-by-case basis. But if this time the FBI detected because the computer algorithm they use detects something funny with the big numbers, like one physician is prescribing more of this kind of medicine, more than entire hospital. So there must be something wrong with that. So the other countries, the one thing that other countries can learn from this is use more big data analysis, and that will help you detect the fraud.
Mm-hmm. We have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Mr. Shi, Assistant Professor from Clemens University, Dr. Jeff Staples from the hospital, United Family Healthcare, and Li Da, Deputy Secretary General of the Beijing Pharmacist Association. And as usual, here is my last point. What caught my attention from this story is that over 52,000 people die of drug abuse every year in the U.S., and that strikes me as a major problem, coupled with the ease with which people can get hold of these drugs. A recent story in the Chinese news was how inhaling laughing gas was causing paralysis to young people in the U.S., just as glue sniffing was a major social problem a decade ago. Although it is dangerous, laughing gas is easily available if you know where to get it. Drug abuse is obviously a huge problem for the U.S., and I'm afraid I think twice about sending my teenage children to America to study. On the other hand, China also needs to be careful with these drugs, as it has become a consumer-driven society where people can get hold of virtually everything. And the percentage of drug users is also on the rise, albeit slowly, according to official sources. So we all need to be vigilant and learn from the US's lesson before the problem gets out of control. That's all for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN Live, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.